The day I walked back into my son's house, I wasn't ready for what I found. The lawn had been freshly mowed, the porch light was on, and through the front window, I could see the blue glow of a television that I had never owned. My son had been dead for 14 months. I stood at the end of the driveway, 63 years old, holding a set of keys that had sat untouched in my kitchen drawer since the funeral. My hands weren't shaking. I was past shaking. I was past crying, past the kind of grief that makes noise. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and colder, the specific stillness that comes when you realize the world has kept moving in directions you were never told about. Before I tell you what I found inside that house, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now reading this? What time is it where you are? Because I've thought a lot about the people who end up hearing this story, strangers in different time zones, different circumstances, and I wonder how many of you have stood at the edge of something you weren't ready to understand. How many of you have looked at a door and known, in your gut, that opening it would change everything? I opened the door. But let me start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without knowing who my son was and who the people around him turned out to be. My son's name was Daniel. He was 31 years old when he died. A cardiac event. The doctors called it one of those clean clinical phrases that does nothing to describe the experience of getting a phone call at 6 in the morning and hearing your daughter-in-law's voice on the other end, strangely flat, saying that Daniel had collapsed in the kitchen and that the paramedics had already come and gone. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. There was nothing anyone could have done. That's what they told me. Nothing anyone could have done. Daniel was my only child. His mother passed when he was 11, and it had been the two of us ever since, through his teenage years, through college, through the early fumbling years of his career in construction management. He built things for a living. He knew how to look at an empty lot and see what it could become. I was proud of him in the way that fathers are proud when a son turns out better than they expected, not just capable, but good. He was a genuinely good person. He had been married to his wife, Renata, for 4 years when he died. They had bought the house together, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. A nice house. A solid house. Daniel had done some of the renovation work himself, refinished the floors, rebuilt the back porch, installed the kitchen cabinets. His hands were in that house. That's something I kept thinking about in the months after. I gave them the down payment. I want to say that plainly, not because I expected anything back, but because it becomes relevant later. $60,000. My retirement savings, partly. I gave it freely because Daniel was my son, and I believed in what they were building together. After the funeral, Renata was distraught. Or she seemed to be. She wore black for weeks. She posted photographs of Daniel on social media with long captions about love and loss that accumulated hundreds of comments from people who had known him. I sat with her in that house for 3 days after the service, and I watched her cry, and I believed her grief was real. I went home to my apartment in Asheville. I called her every week. For the first 2 months, she answered. Then the calls started going to voicemail. Then the voicemails stopped getting returned. I told myself she was processing. Grief does strange things to people. It closes them inward. I had experienced it myself. By month 4, I had not spoken to Renata in 6 weeks. A neighbor of Daniel's, a man named Gerald, who had lived next door for over a decade and had been friendly with my son, called me out of the blue one afternoon. Gerald was in his 70s, a retired postal worker, the kind of man who notices things without making a production of it. He said he wanted to check on me. He asked if I had been to the house recently. I told him I hadn't, that it had been hard to think about going back. He paused for a moment before he spoke again. He said, "I think you should come see for yourself." I asked him what he meant. He said there had been a car in the driveway that he didn't recognize. A truck, dark blue, Tennessee plates. It had been there most nights for the past 2 months. And he had seen a man, not Daniel, obviously. He knew what Daniel looked like coming and going through the front door with the kind of ease that suggested he had a key. I thanked Gerald and told him I'd look into it. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter and stood there for a long time, looking out the window at the Blue Ridge Mountains. The next morning I got in my car and drove 3 hours to Knoxville. I want to tell you about the security system because this is where everything begins to unravel. About 8 months before Daniel died, he had asked me for advice on home security. He'd read about a rash of break-ins in the area and wanted to set something up, cameras, motion sensors, a system that would store footage remotely. I had helped him research the options, and eventually he installed a cloud-based system with 4 cameras, front door, back door, garage, and one covering the backyard. The footage stored automatically to an online account. Daniel had shared the login credentials with me at the time, just in case he was practical about those things, always thought about contingencies. I had written the information in a small notebook and put it in my desk drawer and promptly forgotten about it. I didn't forget about it until I was 40 minutes outside Knoxville, and I realized I should probably know what I was walking into. I pulled into a gas station, called up the camera system on my phone, and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes watching footage. What I saw made my jaw tighten in a way it hasn't since I was a much younger man in situations I'd rather not describe. Renata was living in that house. That part I had assumed, or at least hadn't ruled out. She had every right to be there, the house was in both their names, and whatever the legalities were, I hadn't contested anything. But she was not living there alone. A man I didn't recognize was there constantly. Not occasionally, not as a guest, constantly. His toothbrush was probably next to hers in that bathroom my son had retiled with his own hands. He cooked in that kitchen. He sat on that back porch in the evenings. I watched footage of him mowing the lawn, my son's lawn, with the relaxed confidence of a man completely at home. The footage I was watching was from the previous 2 weeks. I scrolled back further, to the month before. He was there then, too. I sat in that gas station parking lot for a long time. Then I put the car in drive and I kept going. When I pulled up to the house, I didn't park out front. I parked 2 streets over and walked. I don't fully know why. Some instinct. I came around the side of the house and knocked on Gerald's door first. He answered immediately, like he had been expecting me, which he probably had. We sat in his kitchen, and he told me what he knew. The man's name was Corey. Gerald had heard Renata use it once when she'd been on the phone outside. Corey had started showing up about 6 weeks after the funeral. Discreetly, at first late arrivals, early departures. But within 2 months, he had stopped being discreet. Gerald thought he might have moved in sometime around month 3. I asked Gerald if Renata had said anything to him, any explanation, any acknowledgement. He shook his head. She had started avoiding him, he said. If she saw him in the yard, she'd go back inside. She used to wave. Daniel used to come over and have coffee with him on Saturday mornings. That had all simply stopped. I thanked Gerald. I walked across the yard to my son's house. I used my key. The door opened. I'm not going to pretend I walked in calmly. My heart was doing things hearts shouldn't do in men my age. But I went in. The first thing I noticed was the smell different. Not bad, but different. Renata had changed the candles, changed the cleaning products, maybe repainted something. The house smelled like someone else's life. The second thing I noticed was the photographs. Daniel's photographs were gone from the hallway wall. The frames were still there, she'd hung other things in their place. Abstract prints, the kind you find at home goods stores. Where Daniel had hung a photo of the 2 of us at a fishing spot in North Carolina, there was now a framed map of the Tennessee River. I stood in that hallway for a long moment. Then I walked through the house. Slowly, room by room. In the bedroom, there were 2 sets of clothes in the closet, some of Renata's things, and men's clothing that was not Daniel's. A different size, a different style. Work boots by the door that were too large to have been my son's. In the bathroom, 2 razors. In the medicine cabinet, prescription bottles with a different name. I went to the living room and sat down in the chair that had been my son's, the worn leather armchair he'd had since college, the one he'd refused to replace even though Renata had lobbied for a new sectional. The fact that it was still there, that Corey hadn't replaced it with something of his own choosing, was the only thing in that room that felt like Daniel. I pulled out my phone. I called my lawyer. I want to be clear that I'm not a litigious person. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer. I believe in building things carefully, in checking your load-bearing assumptions before you make any moves. I had a lawyer because my wife's estate had required one years ago, and I had maintained the relationship out of habit. His name was Paul, and he was calm the way good lawyers are calm, not indifferent, just steady. I told Paul what I had found. I told him about the down payment. I told him about the camera footage. He told me to stay in the house, not to touch anything, and that he would call me back within the hour. I sat in my son's chair and waited. Paul called back in 50 minutes. He had done some checking. The house, as I knew, had been in Daniel and Renata's names jointly. Upon Daniel's death, under Tennessee law, the property had passed to Renata as the surviving spouse. That was straightforward. My $60,000 contribution, however, given the circumstances, given that it had been documented as a gift with specific conditions attached to a document I had signed but never fully processed, was potentially recoverable. Potentially. Paul wanted to look at the paperwork. But there was something else. Paul had found something in the property records. Renata had initiated a refinancing application on the house 3 months after Daniel's death. She was in the process of pulling equity roughly $90,000 to pay off what appeared to be joint debts. Some of those debts, Paul said carefully, had originated before Daniel's death. Some had not. I asked him to explain the ones that had not originated before Daniel's death. He said, "It looks like someone has been spending quite a bit since the funeral." I stayed in Knoxville for 3 days. I stayed in a motel on the edge of town, the kind with exterior corridors and a vending machine that worked sometimes. I ate breakfast at a diner every morning, and I tried to think clearly. I had the camera footage. I had Paul. I had Gerald as a witness, if it came to that. What I did not have was a complete picture of what Renata and Corey actually were to each other, or how long they had actually been together. That picture came together on the second day, from a source I hadn't expected. Daniel had a friend from college named Marcus who still lived in Knoxville. Marcus had been at the funeral. He had sent me a card afterward, a kind card, the kind where you can tell the person actually chose their words. I had his number. On the second morning, I called him. Marcus came to the diner and sat across from me and ordered coffee and looked at his cup for a while before he spoke. He had known about Corey for 2 years, before Daniel died. He had suspected, at least had seen something at a party that hadn't sat right with him, had heard something through a mutual friend. He hadn't told Daniel because he hadn't been certain, and because he'd told himself it was probably nothing, and because those are the stories we tell ourselves when the truth is too heavy to carry on someone else's behalf. He was sorry, he said. He had been carrying that guilt since the funeral. He should have said something. I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it. Grief finds its own way of distributing blame, and Marcus had already assigned himself more than his share. What Marcus knew, or had pieced together since, was that Renata and Corey had been involved for at least 18 months before Daniel's death. Corey had worked with Renata. She managed accounts for a logistics company, and Corey had been a regional vendor of some kind. They had met professionally. What had started professionally had not stayed that way. Marcus didn't know whether any of this had contributed to Daniel's death. Neither did I. The doctors had been clear that it was cardiac. Daniel had a structural heart condition that had never been diagnosed, a silent thing that had been waiting in his chest since birth. There was no reason to believe otherwise. But I found myself sitting in that diner, running through memories of the last year of my son's life, whether he had seemed stressed, whether something had been wrong that I hadn't noticed, and I had to make myself stop. Because that path leads nowhere good for a man my age. What I focused on instead was what I could actually do. Paul had been busy. By the time I met Marcus for coffee, Paul had filed an initial claim against the estate related to the down payment. He had also, more critically, flagged the refinancing application with the lender, not to block it entirely, but to ensure that the legal claim would be attached to any proceeds. Renata could not pull that equity and disappear with it while a legitimate creditor was on record. On the third day, I went back to the house. This time, Renata was there. She didn't see me come up the walk. She was on the phone on the back porch, which I could see through the side gate. I let myself in through the front and sat in the kitchen and waited. When she came inside and found me sitting at her kitchen table, she went completely still. I want to describe her face in that moment carefully, because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't guilt exactly. It wasn't quite fear. It was the expression of someone who has been running a calculation in their head for a long time and has suddenly realized the numbers are no longer working in their favor. I told her I wasn't there to fight. I told her I had been to see a lawyer. I told her about the cameras calmly, without drama, and I told her I had documentation going back over a year of activity in and around the house. She started to say something. I told her she should probably speak to her own lawyer before she said anything further. Then I stood up, put my key on the table, and walked out. I want to be honest about what happened in the months that followed, because I don't want to make it sound tidier than it was. Legal processes are not tidy. They are slow and expensive and demoralizing in ways that have nothing to do with right or wrong. There were hearings. There were documents. There was a period of about 6 weeks when Paul told me the case could go either way on the down payment issue, and I had to make peace with the possibility that I would lose. I didn't lose. The court found in my favor on the principal claim the $60,000, plus some portion of the accrued interest on the equity that had been drawn against it. It was not everything, but it was enough to matter. Renata and Corey had, by the time the case concluded, already sold the house. They moved somewhere west, I heard through Gerald, who kept me informed with the quiet diligence of a man who understands that loyalty is a form of love. I don't know where they landed. I don't need to. What I did with the money, I want to tell you this, because it matters to me that you know. Daniel had talked. in the last year of his life, about wanting to establish some kind of mentorship program for young men in construction trades. He had started his career without connections, without a network, and he had felt that absence keenly. He wanted to build something that would give other young people the foothold he'd had to find on his own. We had talked about it over dinner one night, the two of us, at a steakhouse in Asheville. He had drawn rough numbers on a napkin. I still have that napkin. I took the money from the settlement and I added it to what I already had. And I started the thing he had described on that napkin. It operates now in partnership with 2 trade schools in Tennessee. It has placed 47 young men and women in apprenticeships in the past 18 months. It carries Daniel's name. I go to Knoxville twice a year. I stay in a decent hotel now, not the one with the unreliable vending machine. I have coffee with Gerald on Saturday mornings. I drive past the house sometimes not to dwell, but because it was where my son's hands built things, and that doesn't go away. What I want to say to you, if you're somewhere in the middle of something like this, if you're standing at the end of a driveway, not sure whether to walk up and open the door, is that you have to open the door. Not because it won't hurt, it will, but because the truth, whatever it is, belongs to you. You are owed it. And there is something that comes after the truth, not closure. I don't believe in closure, but something steadier, something you can build on. Daniel knew how to look at an empty lot and see what it could become. I'm still learning that from him. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing to MK Sweet Revenge. New stories every week, stories about ordinary people, extraordinary betrayals, and the long road back to something solid.